The code was the only place where the world made sense. On Leo Ash's 3 monitors, lines of Python unfurled in a cascade of perfect, irrefutable logic. Here, there were no gray areas, no hidden agendas, no charisma to mask a flawed argument. There was only structure efficiency and a quiet mathematical elegance. If a line was wrong, it failed. If it was right, it worked. And it was clean. His apartment, a 1-bedroom box overlooking the concrete canyon of Seattle's Denny Triangle, was a testament to this mindset. Books on machine learning and algorithmic theory were stacked in precise, load-bearing columns. Cables were meticulously zip-tied and routed along the baseboards. The only chaos was the graveyard of dismantled computer hardware in one corner, a kind of respectful boneyard for ideas that had been superseded by better ones. From his window, the city's tech skyline glittered, dominated by the imposing blue glass monolith of the Nexus Innovations campus. It was a constant, silent reminder. A monument to a life he was supposed to have had. He swiveled in his chair, the squeak of the worn bearings a familiar complaint. On the coffee table next to a cold mug of tea lay the latest issue of Y. The cover subject stared up at him with a look of practiced, visionary intensity. Julian Croft, the man who built the future. Leo felt the familiar, dull ache in his chest. It wasn't anger, not anymore. It was more like the phantom limb pain of an amputee, a persistent throb where something essential used to be. The article, he knew without reading it, would laud Julian's singular genius, his unparalleled foresight, his relentless drive. It would mention the company's humble beginnings in a Bellevue garage, a convenient myth that erased the other person who had been there. A memory flickered unbidden. The scent of cheap pepperoni pizza and the frantic squeak of a dry erase marker. Julian, buzzing with an energy that seemed to light the cramped space, waving his arms as he described the user interface. It has to be intuitive, Leo, like it's reading their mind. And Leo, hunched over a sputtering laptop, his fingers a blur as he translated Julian's grand pronouncements into the foundational logic that would actually make it work. They were a perfect partnership, the showman and the architect. One sold the dream, the other built the reality. He pushed the magazine away, turning back to his freelance project, an optimization algorithm for a logistics company. It was good, honest work. It paid the rent. But it was like a master watchmaker being paid to fix a cuckoo clock. He clicked open a browser tab, intending to check a technical forum. But the headline on the top tech blog snagged his attention: Nexus unveils Synapse, the dawn of predictive AI. He clicked. A slickly produced video began to play. Julian Croft stood on a minimalist stage, a secular prophet in a black turtleneck. He spoke of a new platform, an ecosystem that would anticipate user needs before the user was even aware of them. It would manage your schedule, your home, your life, all through a seamless learning interface. The technology, he explained, was built on a revolutionary predictive engine, an algorithm so advanced it bordered on sentience. Leo leaned closer, his breath fogging a small patch of the screen. He ignored the marketing jargon and focused on the technical diagrams that flashed behind Julian. He saw the data clustering models, the heuristic feedback loops, the core architecture of the neural network. His blood ran cold. The jargon was new. The product name was new. The multi-billion-dollar valuation was new. But the elegant, intricate logic humming beneath it all, the digital soul of the machine, was his. It was the evolution of Genesis, the project that had been his life's work. The code he had bled for, the code he had been fired to protect, now repackaged and sold to the world as another man's miracle. He was the ghost in their machine. And for the first time in a decade, the phantom limb didn't just ache. It burned. The burning sensation didn't fade. For 2 days, Leo walked through his life in a daze, the ghost of his own creation haunting every quiet moment. He tried to code, but his fingers felt clumsy on the keys. The clean, predictable logic of his work offered no comfort against the messy, illogical injustice of his past. The Synapse announcement was more than just a product launch. It was the final, definitive erasure of his name from the story. He found himself walking, with no destination in mind, through the gleaming canyons of South Lake Union. It was a city within a city, a world built by tech money. Armies of young, bright-eyed employees wearing identical fleece vests marched from glass towers to artisanal coffee shops, their lanyards, many bearing the Nexus logo swinging in unison. He walked past the main entrance of the Nexus campus, a vast, intimidating structure of steel and recycled light. A massive screen played the Synapse launch video on a loop. Julian's face, 50 feet tall, looked out over the city he owned, promising a future he hadn't built. Leo felt utterly invisible, a glitch in their perfect world. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again, insistent. He finally pulled it out. The caller ID read Chloe Rain. A warmth spread through his chest, momentarily chasing away the chill. Hey, he answered, his voice rough. I saw it, she said, no preamble needed. Chloe never needed one. Oh, the Synapse thing. I figured you would be, well, I figured I should call. Chloe was one of the original 5, a brilliant project manager who had been the buffer between Leo's technical world and Julian's marketing universe. She had quit 3 months after Leo was pushed out, a gesture of loyalty he had never forgotten. It's his masterpiece, apparently, Leo said, the sarcasm a thin veil over the hurt. And it's your masterpiece, Leo. He just slapped a new coat of paint on it, she shot back, her voice crackling with the indignation he couldn't muster for himself. Listen, this is going to sound crazy, but do you remember that severance package? The one Julian's lawyer shoved in front of you that day? He remembered the day with perfect, painful clarity. The sterile conference room, Julian's feigned sympathy, the suffocating weight of the non-disclosure agreement. Vaguely. I just wanted out of there, I know. But Julian was always so smug about the contracts. He'd say things like, the devil is in the details, the other guy is too stupid to read. Did you ever really read it, Leo? Specifically, the section on intellectual property rights? He dismissed it as legal garbage, boilerplate stuff. The conversation stuck with him long after they hung up. The devil is in the details. He returned to his apartment, a strange, nervous energy propelling him forward. He went to the closet and pulled down a box labeled Old Docs. Inside, beneath tax returns and outdated user manuals, was a slim file folder. Inside that, a USB drive. He plugged it into his computer. The drive contained a single, password-protected PDF, L-Severance Final PDF. He stared at the password prompt. His mind raced through old possibilities. He tried the name of their first server, Prometheus. Incorrect password. He tried the address of the garage. Incorrect password. He paused, thinking back to that last awful day. What was Julian's obsession at the time? A smug little phrase he kept repeating in meetings. Leo typed it in, move fast, break things. The document unlocked. It was 30 pages of dense, mind-numbing legalese. He scrolled through the non-disclosure terms, the non-compete clauses, the standard release of claims. It was all designed to muzzle him, to erase him. Then he found it. Section 7, subsection B, Intellectual Property and Foundational Works. His eyes scanned the text, his brain parsing the convoluted sentences. He read it once, then again, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. The language was deliberately opaque, buried in a sea of corporate jargon, but the core of it was unmistakable. It stipulated that while the company retained ownership of all code written on its time, the originating architect of any foundational source code, defined as a core engine upon which future product lines were built, was entitled to a royalty. A small percentage, but a percentage nonetheless. In perpetuity. It was a clause designed never to be seen, a contractual coffin meant to bury his rights so deep no one would ever find them. Julian, in his arrogance, must have assumed the quiet, conflict-averse coder he'd just fired would never have the guts or the foresight to look. He had been right. For 10 years. Leo leaned back, the squeak of his chair echoing in the silent apartment. He looked from the glowing text on his screen to the glittering Nexus tower in the distance. The ghost in the machine wasn't just a memory. He was a creditor. The next 72 hours were a fever dream of caffeine and spreadsheets. The clause was a key, but Leo needed to know what door it unlocked. He became a digital detective, hunting through a decade of Nexus's publicly available quarterly earnings reports, shareholder meetings, and SEC filings. He cross-referenced product announcements with revenue streams, isolating the technologies that were direct descendants of his Genesis algorithm. The mobile operating system, the cloud computing division, the new Synapse platform, they all branched from the same trunk. They were all fruit from his tree. He wrote a script to collate the data, to filter and calculate. When the final number materialized on his screen, he felt a wave of vertigo. The number was nonsensical in abstraction. It had too many commas. 2,714,358,921. It couldn't be real. It was a phantom, a bug in his own code. He reran the calculations. The number remained obstinate and absurd. $2.7 billion. The sheer scale of it was terrifying. This wasn't a dispute, it was a declaration of war against a global superpower. His internal conflict, the voice that had told him to stay quiet and avoid trouble for a decade, screamed at him now. They will crush you. Julian is a beloved icon. You are a nobody. They will paint you as a bitter, greedy failure, and the world will believe them. He paced his small apartment, the multi-billion-dollar figure burning a hole in his screen, feeling like a man who had just found a map to a dragon's hoard and was realizing he'd have to fight the dragon to get it. He almost deleted the file. He almost convinced himself it was better to remain a ghost than to be publicly exorcised. He called the only person he could. He met Chloe at a small, independent coffee shop far from the South Lake Union Tech Hub. The place smelled of roasted beans and old books, a comforting anchor to a world outside of code and contracts. She saw the panic in his eyes before he even spoke. He pushed his laptop across the table and showed her the spreadsheet and the clause. She read it, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock and then to a fierce, incandescent grin. "Oh, that magnificent, arrogant bastard," she breathed, shaking her head in disbelief. "He never thought you'd look. He never thought you'd defight. I don't know if I can, Chloe," Leo confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "Oh, look at me. Look at him. It's insane." Chloe reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her grip was firm. "Think about the garage, Leo. Think about the all-nighters, the moment you got the primary Genesis loop to work. You were shouting so loud you woke up the neighbors. You built the engine. He just painted the car and put his name on it. Don't you think the engine builder deserves to get paid?" Her belief in him was a shield. It didn't make the fear go away, but it made it manageable. "What do I do?" She gave him a name written on a napkin. "Anya Sharma. She's not one of the downtown corporate sharks," Chloe explained. "She's an IP specialist. A giant killer. She likes impossible fights." The journey to Anya Sharma's office felt like a pilgrimage. It wasn't in a high-rise. It was on the second floor of a historic brick building in Pioneer Square, above a rare bookstore. The elevator was a rattling cage, the hallway smelled faintly of aging paper. The door simply said, "SHARMA Attorney AT Law." The woman who greeted him was not what he expected. Anya Sharma was in her early 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a simple dark dress and her black hair was pulled back in a severe bun. Her office was a fortress of knowledge, the walls lined not with degrees but with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves groaning with legal texts. It was the office of a scholar, a tactician. "Oh, Mr. Ash," she said, her voice calm and direct. She didn't offer coffee. She gestured for him to sit. "Chloe Rain said you had a contract problem." Leo's hands trembled slightly as he set up his laptop. He felt like an imposter, a kid playing at being a grown-up. He walked her through the story, his voice gaining strength as he got to the technical details, the part of the world where he was fluent. He showed her the Genesis architecture, the Synapse platform, and how one was undeniably the child of the other. Finally, he brought up the severance agreement, highlighting the clause. Anya listened without a single interruption, her face an unreadable mask of professional neutrality. She leaned forward, reading the clause on his screen. She read it 3 times, her eyes narrowed in concentration. Then she stood up and walked to one of her shelves, pulling down a heavy, leather-bound volume. She flipped through the pages, paused, and nodded to herself. She sat back down and looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. She was no longer assessing a potential case, she was assessing the man. "They will bury you, Mr. Ash," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. It was not a warning, it was a statement of fact. "Their legal team bills more in an hour than you make in a year. They will call you a liar, a fraud, a bitter failure clinging to another man's success. They will use their billion-dollar public relations machine to turn your life inside out and make you wish you'd never been born. They will do everything in their power to break you, personally and professionally, long before you ever see the inside of a courtroom. Are you ready for that? Anya Sharma's words hung in the air of the book-lined office, heavy and cold as iron. Are you ready for that? The question was a door, an emergency exit back to his quiet, invisible life. He could say no. He could thank her for her time, walk out of her office, and go back to his freelance work. He could let the ghost remain a ghost. The burning sense of injustice would fade back to the familiar, dull ache. It would be safer. Saner. His mind flashed back to the day he was fired. It hadn't been a dramatic showdown. It had been a quiet, clinical execution. Julian had called him into the glass-walled conference room he'd always hated. He'd spoken in a tone of deep, sorrowful regret, the kind a surgeon might use before an amputation. Leo, your contribution has been immeasurable. But the company is moving in a new direction. We need a different kind of leadership for the next phase. He hadn't been fired for incompetence. He'd been fired for the opposite. He had argued against rushing the Genesis 2 rollout, insisting on more rigorous security testing. Julian, chasing a new round of funding, saw his caution as obstruction. The architect was getting in the way of the salesman. Julian hadn't just fired him, he'd gaslighted him, framing Leo's technical prudence as a lack of vision. He remembered the condescending pat on the shoulder. He remembered packing his desk into a cardboard box while the employees he had mentored studiously avoided his gaze. He remembered the first company history article that appeared a year later, where his role as co-founder had been downgraded to early engineer. A few years after that, he was just a name on a list of initial hires. Now he wasn't even a footnote. He had been systematically, deliberately deleted. And now there was Synapse. His work, his logic, his sleepless nights and eureka moments, being used to build a future that had no place for him. A future built on the foundation of his erasure. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. But beneath it, something else was solidifying. A decade of suppressed anger. A quiet, deep-seated stubbornness. The part of him that knew, with the certainty of a mathematical proof, that he was right. He met Anya's unflinching gaze. "Oh yes," he said. The word was quiet, but it filled the room. It was the sound of a lock clicking into place. "I'm ready," a subtle shift occurred in Anya's demeanor. The corner of her mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. The professional mask cracked just enough to show the warrior beneath. "Good," she said, a new energy in her voice. "Because I believe you. I've seen this kind of corporate arrogance before. They count on their victims being too scared or too broken to fight. And as for this contract," she tapped his laptop screen, "it's a thing of beauty. A ticking time bomb they planted in their own basement." She stood up and walked to her desk. "I'll take the case on contingency. My firm gets a percentage of the settlement or verdict. If we lose, you owe me nothing but your time and your trust. But you will be responsible for the expenses, filing fees, expert witnesses, depositions. It will be expensive. You need to understand that," Leo nodded. He had his savings. It wasn't much, not in this world, but it was a start. "I understand. Then we have a lot of work to do." For the next hour, Anya transformed from skeptic to strategist. She outlined the long road ahead, the filing of the complaint, the inevitable motion to dismiss, the discovery phase, the depositions. Her mind was a whirlwind of legal chess moves, and for the first time, Leo felt like he had an ally who spoke a language as complex and powerful as his own. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the office window by the time she was done. Anya turned to her own monitor, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. She drafted the initial court filing, Leo Ash, plaintiff v. Nexus Innovations and Julian Croft, defendants, the words stark and official on the screen. She paused, her finger hovering over the mouse. "Oh, this is it, Mr. Ash. Once I click this, the world changes." There is no going back. Leo stood beside her, watching the cursor blink. A digital heartbeat. He thought of the garage, of the dream he and Julian once shared. He thought of the man on the magazine cover, a king sitting on a throne of stolen code. "My name is Leo," he said softly. Anya looked up at him, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "Click it," Leo said. Oh, she did. The sound of the mouse click was small, insignificant, yet it echoed with the force of a thrown gauntlet. The complaint was filed. The dragon had been notified of his presence in the antechamber. The war had begun. The Empire's response was not a roar, but the cold, silent venom of a viper. 2 days after the filing, a courier delivered a thick, cream-colored envelope to Leo's apartment. It contained a letter from Marcus Thorne, lead counsel for Thorne, Lynch & Castor, the most feared corporate law firm on the West Coast. The letterhead was embossed, the language suffocatingly polite, and the message was a declaration of total war. It called Leo's claims frivolous and defamatory, and promised to seek not only the lawsuit's immediate dismissal but also sanctions against Leo and his counsel for filing in bad faith. It was a clear, brutal threat: drop this now or we will ruin you. Anya was unfazed. A love letter, she'd called it when Leo read it to her over the phone. It means we have their attention. Good. The real attack came a week later. The first shot was fired by ByteStream, the most influential tech blog in the industry. The headline was a gut punch: disgruntled ex-employee sues Nexus CEO Julian Croft, alleging billion-dollar fantasy. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. It painted Leo as a mediocre programmer who had been let go for performance reasons a decade ago. It quoted anonymous sources from the company's early days who described him as difficult to work with and lacking the visionary spark that defined Julian Croft. The narrative was clear and devastating. This was a shakedown, the pathetic, greedy gambit of a man left behind by history, now trying to extort the genius who had built an empire. Julian, through a Nexus spokesperson, declined to comment, a move that made him seem above the fray, saddened by the desperate actions of a former colleague. Leo felt like he'd been physically struck. Every word was a lie, a careful distortion, but it was printed for the world to see. His name, once merely forgotten, was now being actively slandered. His worst fears were being broadcast in real time. This is the playbook, Anya said, her voice a steadying presence during their next meeting in her office. The article was open on her monitor. It's called Poisoning the Well. They're not arguing the case, they're trying to make you so toxic that no one will ever believe you. The press, the judge, a potential jury. Ignore it. It's just noise, but it wasn't just noise. It was the sound of his reputation being shredded. He stopped answering his phone, which buzzed with calls from reporters. His email inbox was a flood of alerts from Google, each a link to another site picking up the ByteStream story. Anya, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of focused energy. She filed a response to Nexus's motion to dismiss, a brilliant, tightly argued document that dismantled their legal arguments one by one. And she began preparing Leo for the ordeal to come, the deposition. For hours on end, she drilled him. She transformed from his ally into a ruthless interrogator, adopting the persona of Marcus Thorne. She twisted his words, questioned his motives, picked at his insecurities. Oh, Mr. Ash, isn't it true you were fired because you couldn't keep up with the pace of innovation at Nexus? No, I was fired because I urged caution. So you admit you were slowing the company down, obstructing progress? It was grueling, humiliating. It forced him to relive every painful memory and defend every decision he'd ever made. But through it all, Anya was forging him into a weapon. She was teaching him how to block, how to parry, how to answer the question that was asked, not the one that was implied. The financial pressure began to mount. The initial filing fees were just the beginning. There were costs for private investigators to track down former employees, fees for transcribing records, retainers for expert witnesses who could validate his claims about the code. Anya's firm was fronting some of it, but Leo had to contribute. He watched as the savings he had carefully accumulated over a decade of freelance work began to hemorrhage. He sold his stock portfolio. He cashed out his retirement accounts. It felt like he was feeding $100 bills into a furnace just to keep the fire from going out, while on the other side, Nexus had an infinite forest to burn. They weren't just trying to win the case, they were trying to bankrupt him into submission. The motion to dismiss was denied. Anya's brilliantly written response had convinced the judge that Leo's case, however audacious, had merit based on the contractual language. It was a small victory, but a crucial one. It meant they were headed for discovery. It meant they had the right to ask for documents. It meant they could start digging. Their new headquarters became Anya's cramped back office, a room piled high with case files and legal books. Late nights blurred into early mornings, fueled by lukewarm coffee from a nearby diner and a shared, obsessive sense of purpose. The court order gave them access, but Nexus, under the guidance of Marcus Thorne, made it an exercise in frustration. They complied by drowning them in data, terabytes of irrelevant files, corrupted archives, and heavily redacted email chains. It was a digital needle in a haystack operation designed to exhaust their resources. "They're hiding something," Anya said, staring at a screen of blacked-out paragraphs. "Now we just have to find it." The burden of the search fell to Leo. While Anya navigated the legal minefield, he began the painful process of excavating his own past. He pulled old towers out of his closet, their plastic shells yellowed with age, and began the delicate work of retrieving data from their dormant hard drives. He reactivated ancient email accounts, blowing the digital dust off conversations that hadn't been read in a decade. Each file was a ghost. He found old chat logs with Julian, filled with in-jokes and breathless, excited plans for the future. "We're going to change everything, man," Julian had written. The memory was so sharp, so full of youthful optimism, it felt like a fresh betrayal. He found the first lines of code for Genesis he'd ever written, a file named Hello World Plus Pi. It was a digital fossil from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. He was hitting a wall. The digital trail went cold around the time of his departure. It was clear Julian had instigated a thorough scrub of the servers. Chloe became his lifeline. Bound by her own NDA, she couldn't give him documents, but she could give him memories. She could point him in the right direction. They met weekly at the same quiet coffee shop. Julian was paranoid about data, she recalled one afternoon, stirring her latte. But he was also cheap in the early days. He never wanted to pay for proper archiving. Remember Project Chimera, the first big enterprise pitch? Everything for that was stored on a third-party cloud server to save space on our main system. He decommissioned it right after you left, said it was a security risk. A light went on in Leo's mind. Decommissioned didn't always mean deleted. That night, Leo sat at his computer, his heart pounding. He tracked down the now-obscure cloud hosting company. He still remembered the login credentials. He had set up the account himself. He entered his old username and password, half expecting a rejection notice. Access granted. He was in. It was a digital catacomb, a maze of forgotten folders and obsolete file types. He spent hours searching, until finally he found a folder labeled P Chimera VC Deck Final V2. Inside, a single PowerPoint presentation. He opened it. It was the pitch deck they had used to secure their first round of major funding. And there it was. Slide 4, the team, there were two pictures. A smiling, confident Julian Croft, titled CEO and Visionary, and a younger, more serious Leo Ashe, titled Co-founder and Chief Architect. He clicked through the slides, his breath catching in his throat. Slide 7 was titled The Irreplaceable Core. It featured a simplified schematic of his Genesis algorithm. The text below it was damning. Nexus's proprietary Genesis engine, designed by Leo Ashe, is the foundational technology that powers our entire platform. It is our defensible, unbreachable competitive advantage. And then he found the email folder. It contained a single forwarded chain. The original message was from Julian to a prominent venture capitalist. The investor was asking about the company's technical strength. Julian's reply was the smoking gun. "To be perfectly frank," Julian had written, "without Leo's Genesis code, we are just another app with a slick UI. He's the entire company's secret sauce." Leo stared at the words, a triumphant, almost manic laugh escaping his lips. And it was all there. The acknowledgement of his role, the admission of the code's foundational importance, the proof that Julian's public narrative was a carefully constructed lie. Anya's reaction was one of pure predatory delight. "They're liars, Leo," she said, her eyes gleaming in the light of the monitor. "And now we can prove it." The discovery of the Chimera deck and the email changed the entire complexion of the case. Armed with irrefutable proof that Nexus was withholding key documents, Anya filed an emergency motion to compel. The judge, furious at Nexus's blatant obstruction, granted it. Thorne was apoplectic. They had to open their internal archives. For a brief, glorious week, it felt like the tide had turned. The Goliath was bleeding. Leo allowed himself a sliver of hope. He had gone from being a passive victim of the past to an active driver of his own future. He had found the ghost in the machine, and it was finally speaking. Julian Croft and Marcus Thorne did not take the loss lying down. They didn't just defend, they launched a counteroffensive of such surgical brutality it left Leo reeling. The first strike came from the documents they were forced to turn over. Thorne's team, masters of legal jujitsu, used their own archives against him. They isolated a single, complex function within the Genesis code and found a superficial resemblance to a piece of code published in an obscure academic paper a year before Leo wrote his. With the help of a highly paid, expert witness from Stanford, they crafted a damning narrative. Leo Ashe wasn't a genius, he was a plagiarist. The foundational code he claimed as his own was, in fact, stolen. It was a grotesque distortion. Any programmer would recognize it as the equivalent of accusing Shakespeare of plagiarism, because he used words that already existed. But to a layperson, to a reporter, to a jury, it sounded plausible. The tech blogs fed the story by Nexus's PR machine ran with it. The narrative shifted overnight. Leo wasn't just a disgruntled failure, he was a fraud. The second strike was more personal. Julian reached out to Ben Carter, one of the first engineers they had hired, a man who had worked closely with Leo and had initially agreed privately to be a friendly witness. Leo never found out what was said. Perhaps it was a threat about his own career, a reminder of the NDAs he'd signed, or an offer of stock options he couldn't refuse. The result was a curt, devastating email to Anya's office. Upon reviewing my records, Ben wrote, I realize my memory of Mr. Ashe's role was inaccurate. I am no longer willing to testify, their key witness had been flipped. The final blow was a legal masterstroke of pure malicious genius. Buried deep in Leo's original employment contract was a non-compete clause, one so broad and overreaching it was almost certainly unenforceable in the state of Washington. But fighting it would take time and money they didn't have. Thorne's firm filed for an immediate injunction, claiming that Leo's current freelance work for the logistics company utilized proprietary knowledge and trade secrets learned during his time at Nexus. A judge, cautious in the face of a trade secrets claim, granted a temporary restraining order. Effective immediately, Leo was barred from working on any project involving algorithmic optimization. His only source of income was gone. The sequence of attacks was dizzying, a three-punch combination that left him on the canvas. He was professionally discredited, his key witness had vanished, and now he was financially crippled. The last of his savings evaporated paying his rent and legal expenses. He was borrowing money from Chloe just to buy groceries. He sat in Anya's office, the injunction notice on the table between them. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a hollow, echoing despair. He had stood up, he had pushed back, and the machine had simply, efficiently, and mercilessly crushed him. His fear of confrontation, his decade of passivity, hadn't been a flaw, it had been a survival instinct. You were right, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He couldn't meet her eyes. From the very first day. You said they would bury me. Anya stared at the notice, her jaw tight. She looked at Leo, saw the profound defeat in his posture, the vacant look in his eyes. All seemed lost. The ghost had been cornered and the exorcism was nearly complete. But Anya Sharma was a giant killer. And giants were always at their most arrogant right before they fell. They haven't buried us yet, Leo, she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. They've just made this personal. The courtroom was a theater of corporate power. It was sleek and modern with polished wood and brushed steel. Marcus Thorne and his team of 4 junior associates occupied one table, a phalanx of immaculate dark suits. At the other table sat Julian Croft, looking less like a defendant and more like a visiting dignitary, his expression one of bored but patient magnanimity. And then there was Leo and Anya, a two-person insurgency in the heart of the empire. Anya had kept the case alive through sheer, bloody-minded tenacity, navigating a blizzard of motions and procedural traps. But the smear campaign had done its damage. The plagiarism allegation, though flimsy, had muddied the waters. The loss of Ben as a witness had crippled their ability to corroborate Leo's story. It had all come down to this, the trial. And it was going badly. Thorne's expert witnesses were polished, credible, and devastating. They spoke a language of impenetrable jargon that left the jury looking confused and impressed. Anya's cross-examinations were skillful, but it was like punching water. Thorne had built a narrative, and it was solidifying. On the third day, during a recess, Anya turned to Leo in the hall. Her face was grim. Their narrative is that you're a liar with the technicality of a contract. The jury is getting lost in the code. They're forgetting the story. Our only weapon left is you, me. Leo's stomach turned to ice. I'm not, I can't, you have to, she said, her gaze firm. They made this entire case about your character, Leo. The only person who can defend it is you. You need to get on that stand and tell them who you are. The walk to the witness stand felt like miles. He sat down, his hands clammy, his throat dry. Anya approached, her expression calm and reassuring. She didn't start with the contract or the money. She started with the garage. Oh, Mr. Ash, she began, her voice quiet, can you tell the jury about Project Genesis? And Leo began to talk. He started not with the code, but with the idea, the dream of a system that could learn, that could anticipate. As he spoke, something shifted. He was no longer a plaintiff in a lawsuit. He was the creator telling the story of his creation. He described the thrill of solving an impossible problem, the beauty of an elegant algorithm. His voice, at first hesitant, grew stronger, more passionate. He was teaching. He was translating the cold, hard logic of his world into a human story of passion and discovery. Then came Thorne's cross-examination. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Thorne prowled before the witness box, his questions dripping with condescension and disbelief. Oh, Mr. Ash, you claim to be the sole architect of Genesis, is that correct? A rather grand title for a junior programmer in a two-man startup, wouldn't you agree? I wrote the foundational code. Julian handled the business. Ah yes, Julian Croft. The man who turned your little garage project into a $100 billion global enterprise. While you, what have you been doing for the last decade, Mr. Ash? A little freelance work. The courtroom was silent. Julian watched, a faint smirk playing on his lips. This was the moment Leo's inner journey came to a head. The old Leo would have shrunk, stammered, allowed Thorne to frame him as a failure. But 10 years of resentment and months of being forged in the fire of Anya's preparation had changed him. He felt a surge of cold, clear anger. He looked past Thorne, his gaze landing directly on Julian. Then he turned to the jury, making eye contact with a woman in the front row. I've been working, Leo said, his voice steady and clear. And I've been watching as the work I did, the work that Mr. Croft himself, in emails he tried to hide, called the secret sauce, and the irreplaceable core of his company, was used to build an empire that erased me. He then calmly and in simple, devastating terms dismantled the plagiarism claim. He explained how code development works, using an analogy of building with Legos. The other paper used a standard red brick. I used a standard red brick. But what I built with that brick and the thousands of others I designed myself was a castle. They are accusing me of stealing a brick. He was no longer just a witness. He was in command. Thorne, for the first time, seemed off balance, his theatrical bullying rendered ineffective by Leo's quiet, unshakable confidence. As Thorne retreated, looking flustered, Anya stood up. Your Honor, the plaintiff calls a rebuttal witness. Lemes. Eleanor Vance, a woman in her 60s with an air of quiet dignity, walked to the stand. She was a former member of Nexus's board of directors, one of the first, who had been forced out by Julian years ago in a power struggle. Thorne's objection was overruled. Anya's questions were brief and pointed. Lemes. Vance, were you present at a board meeting on June 12, 8 years ago, where the company's official history for a magazine profile was discussed? I was. And did Julian Croft comment on Leo Ash's role? He did. And do you have a record of that meeting? I have my personal notes, she said. And I have an audio recording. A gasp went through the courtroom. Thorne was on his feet, shouting objections. But it was too late. The judge allowed it. A small audio player was connected to the court's sound system. The recording was tinny, but the voice was unmistakable. It was Julian, arrogant and dismissive, chuckling with his inner circle. Look, the media loves the story of the lone genius. It's cleaner, simpler. We just had to push the nerd out and bury his name deep enough. It's not like he was ever going to fight back anyway. The sound of his own arrogance, his own betrayal, filled the silent courtroom. Julian Croft's face, projected on the monitors for the jury to see, was a frozen mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Checkmate. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. The court clerk read the verdict, her voice a flat monotone that did nothing to diminish the explosive power of the words. On the charge of breach of contract, we the jury find in favor of the plaintiff, Leo Ashe. She paused, shuffling a paper. We award damages in the amount of $2,714,358,921, the full amount, down to the last dollar he had calculated in his apartment. The aftermath was a hurricane of noise and light. The moment they stepped outside the courthouse, they were engulfed by a mob of reporters shouting questions, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. Leo, overwhelmed and stunned, instinctively shrank back. But Anya, a fierce grin on her face, stepped in front of him, a lioness shielding her cub. She took the podium, her voice ringing out clear and triumphant, as she spoke of justice and corporate accountability. Over her shoulder, Leo saw Chloe in the crowd, tears streaming down her face, her smile the brightest thing in the world. The days that followed were a blur. The story was everywhere. The narrative Julian had spent a decade crafting was shattered in an instant. The headlines told the story: Julian Croft fired as Nexus CEO following damning verdict. Nexus stock plummets 30% ON founder scandal. The ghost in the machine, the forgotten founder Leo Ashe who took on Goliath and won. The world now saw Julian for who he was, not a visionary but a thief. Marcus Thorne, for his part, simply vanished from the public eye, his reputation as an invincible legal titan permanently tarnished. A week later, Leo stood in Anya's office. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a profound quiet. The dozens of boxes containing the case files were stacked against one wall, a paper monument to their impossible victory. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a profound sense of vindication. "You did it, Leo," Anya said, handing him a mug of tea. He looked around the book-lined office that had been his sanctuary and his war room. "No," he replied, a small, genuine smile finally reaching his face. "We did it." It was a moment of pure, unspoken mutual respect. The warrior and the architect had brought down a king. Later that evening, he met Chloe. They didn't go to a fancy restaurant to celebrate. They walked along the waterfront at Myrtle Edwards Park, the gray waters of Puget Sound stretching out before them. The weight of the last decade, the suffocating burden of the lawsuit, had finally lifted. For the first time, they could talk about the future without the shadow of the past looming over them. "What are you going to do with it all?" Chloe asked, her voice soft. "Buy an island." Leo looked out at the horizon. The money was still an abstract concept, a number on a page. The victory wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming his story, his name. "I have an idea," he said, a spark of the old, creative excitement returning to his eyes. "Something I should have done a long time ago." 6 months later, Leo stood not in a mansion or on the deck of a yacht, but in a sprawling, light-filled space that smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. The building, a renovated brick warehouse in Seattle's industrial district, was the new headquarters for the Genesis Foundation. The name was a reclamation, a defiant statement. Using a significant portion of the settlement, Leo had established an open-source incubator and, more importantly, a nonprofit legal defense fund for young software developers and innovators. Its mission was simple: to protect the next generation of creators from the predators of the corporate world. He was giving a welcome address to the Foundation's first cohort, a dozen brilliant, idealistic young coders who had been selected for a year-long fellowship. He stood before them, not behind a podium, but on the same level, a colleague among peers. The hesitant, conflict-averse man from the one-bedroom apartment was gone. In his place stood a leader, his voice resonating with a quiet confidence that had been earned in the crucible of his legal battle. He spoke about the beauty of code, but also about the importance of contracts. He told them about the necessity of owning their work, of understanding their value, of never letting anyone else tell their story for them. He was not just giving a speech, he was passing on the hard-won lessons of his own journey. Chloe stood at the back of the room, watching him. She was the Foundation's chief operating officer, the pragmatic organizational force that turned Leo's vision into a functional reality. Their old partnership had been reborn, stronger and more meaningful than before, built now on a foundation of shared purpose and absolute trust. After the presentation, the fellows broke into groups, their excited chatter filling the cavernous space. Leo walked over to a massive whiteboard that covered an entire wall, a fresh set of markers in his hand. One of the young fellows, a prodigy in quantum computing, eagerly followed him. "Oh, Mr. Ash, about that neural net stabilization problem," she began. Leo picked up a black marker, the familiar feel of it a comfort in his hand. He looked at the vast, empty white space, not as a daunting void, but as a field of infinite possibility. He was back in his element, but he was no longer the same man. He was not a ghost hidden behind a screen. He was an architect in the truest sense of the word, ready to design what came next. A genuine smile spread across his face, free from the shadows of the past. "Okay," he said, the marker touching the board. "Let's build it."